Welcome to Crash Concepts, where the economy, energy, and the environment are explored. Up next, fresh ideas and insights into the factors that are driving the world and shaping your future. Presenting information you can't afford to live without, here's Chris Martenson.
Hello, this is another ChrisMartenson.com podcast, and I am your host, of course, Chris Martenson. Today is February 10th, 2012, and the world is in a bit of economic turmoil. Greece is flat out busted, the EU's in recession, Japan's struggling with a too strong yen, and the U.S. government is spending at least 40% more than it's taking in revenue for the fourth year in a row. To help us make sense of all this is Jim Rickards, seasoned financier, risk manager, and author of the recent bestseller, Currency Wars. In his book, he describes how currency wars are one of the most destructive and feared outcomes in international economics, and that history shows they always end badly. He warns that today we're engaged in a new currency war, posing risks that every prudent individual should be aware of. For those of you with smoldering concerns about the viability of the world's fiat currencies, I sense this interview is going to toss some gasoline onto that fire. Jim, welcome. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest today.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for inviting me.
Your newest book, Currency Wars, The Making of the Next Global Economic Crisis, is doing extremely well. Is sitting this morning at number 280 on the Amazon book list. I checked. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, we've been very happy with the result. It's been a New York Times and national bestseller and very highly ranked in Amazon. And they have some subcategories in the international economics category. We've been number one for 3 straight months. So very happy with the reception.
Well, fantastic. And the headline summary of your book, if I could, is that the Fed and other central banks are making a very dangerous gamble that might end well, but if history's any guide, as we said, has a better chance of ending quite badly. Before we get to that endgame, though, can we set the stage? What does history tell us about currency debasement and these sorts of trade wars?
Sure. Well, the currency war in the simplest form, Chris, is it's basically when there's, I think they start when there's too much debt and not enough growth. The overhang of debt impedes growth because it clogs up bank balance sheets and clogs up the savings to investment mechanism and has a lot of negative effects. There's not enough growth to go around. So countries, in effect, try to steal growth from their trading partners by cheapening their currencies. One way to think about it, imagine you live in a small town. There are 4 stores. They all sell sort of the same thing, and one of them has a half-off sale. Well, naturally, everyone's going to go to the place that has the half-off sale. Well, it's no different in currencies. You look around the world, there are certain countries that manufacture aircraft. We have Boeing in the United States. There's Airbus in Europe, Embraer in Brazil, and China's got an up-and-coming aircraft industry. Well, imagine you're Thailand or Indonesia, a country that needs aircraft but doesn't manufacture them. You're going to buy them from one of those countries, and if you cheapen the dollar, it makes the Boeing aircraft a little cheaper and helps some sales. From that, you get exports, which contributes to growth, and you probably get some additional jobs on the Boeing assembly line. So it sounds good. It's very tempting. It sounds like a free lunch. Why not do it? And indeed, the Fed and the Treasury are trying to do that right now. They're trying to cheapen the dollar, partly for the reason I mentioned. The problem is it doesn't stop at that. It invites retaliation. And this is why I give so many historical examples as well as analysis. A couple things happen. Number one, we cheapen our currency, but other countries try to cheapen their currency also. So you get into these tit-for-tat devaluations where nobody wins. All you do is unleash inflation, restrict world trade without anyone getting an advantage. I like to say that in the currency wars, all advantage is temporary. You give it up pretty quickly. The other thing is for countries that can't necessarily devalue, they can use capital controls. They can use import excise taxes. Currency wars can turn into trade wars. Ultimately, they can even turn into shooting wars. So you get all these bad effects. So if the U.S. could cheapen the dollar in isolation and nothing else happened, maybe there'd be some quick advantage, but that's not what happens. And so, but it's a temptation that politicians and policymakers can't resist, but it ends very badly. Just to give 2 specific examples I talk about in the book, I give the history of what I call Currency War I, from 1921 to 1936, and Currency War II from 1967 to 1987. In Currency War I, we went through, that's coterminous to a great extent with the Great Depression. World trade collapsed, currencies collapsed, unemployment skyrocketed, just a set of disastrous outcomes. In Currency War II, we had the opposite. We had borderline hyperinflation. When President Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard in 1971, at the time, his aides predicted this would create 500,000 new jobs over the next 2 years. Instead, the United States entered on one of the worst periods of economic performance in its history outside the Great Depression. We had 3 recessions back to back to back in 1974, 1979, 1981. So what these historical examples show is that you either get depression or inflation, but either way it's a bad outcome. But you would think the policymakers and politicians would understand and learn the lessons of history, but they don't, and they're just attempted to launch these currency wars over and over again, but they always end badly.
You know, I want to, right at the beginning you said that debt is the original reason that we start these currency wars. So maybe in the first period you mentioned in the 20s, early 30s, that was arguably debt left over from World War I. And so ever since the 1970s, debt levels worldwide, but in the U.S. specifically, have consistently, year after year, risen faster than GDP. You know, just a few percentage points each year, but debt trumped income. In enabling all of that, I feel, was the steadily falling interest rates from the peaks in 1980 all the way on down through to current. And now Bernanke signaled rates are going to stay pegged at 0 on the short end until 2014 and be lower than otherwise on the long end because of Operation Twist and whatever else might come next. How long can they keep playing this game, do you think?
Well, they can play it until they can't. And, I mean, not to be glib, but the problem I see, and Chris, you're absolutely right about the debt, going back to Currency War I, the debt in that case consisted of German war reparations that came out of the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I, and Germany owed unpayable debts to England and France. But England and France also owed unpayable debts to the United States because they had borrowed money to fight World War I. So you had the spectacle of the entire world in debt. None of it could be repaid. Ultimately, none of it was repaid. I mean, eventually Adolf Hitler repudiated the reparations, and the United States forgave the war debt, and we ended up in World War II, and the whole thing was forgotten. Then in 1944, we rebooted the International Monetary System at the Bretton Woods Conference. But that was one contributor to the Great Depression. There were others, but that helped to start the currency wars. In the 1970s, you had a different set of debt. You had what was known as the guns and butter policy, really started by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, but the effects of it were first seen in terms of currency wars in 1967. The guns part was the massive expansion of the U.S. presence in Vietnam. We'd been in Vietnam for a long time, but Johnson started to send tens of thousands and ultimately hundreds of thousands of troops there, and that was very costly. But at the same time, he launched the Great Society program of entitlements and benefits, which added to the domestic spending. The combination caught up with the United States very quickly to the point that we were, as I say, the dollar was suffering and inflation was breaking out in the 1970s. So debt was the problem in both cases. No different today. I see the same thing today. When you look at the European sovereign debt crisis, Japan's debt to GDP ratio over 200%, far worse than Greece, by the way. The United States, it's officially 100%, but that only counts the bonded debt. When you throw in, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, FHA, Federal Home Loan Bank System, student loans, and all the other liabilities that the government has underwritten, the actual ratio is 1,000%, meaning 10 times GDP. None of this debt can be repaid, by the way, so what will happen is governments are going to try to inflate their way out of it. It's as if we'll say to the Chinese, hey, we owe you $1 trillion. Here's your $1 trillion. Good luck buying a loaf of bread because we've completely debased the currency. So there's no question, it's quite clear, that the Treasury and the Fed are trying to inflate their way out of the problem and debase the dollar. The problem I see is they might not get there, and here's why. The Fed thinks they're playing with a thermostat. You can, if the room's too cold, you dial it up. If the room's too hot, you dial it down by adjusting the money supply and working a little bit with expectations on the behavioral side. They can gradually tweak economic behavior and lending and spending velocity and money supply to achieve a desired result. The problem is they're actually playing with a nuclear reactor. They're playing with a complex system that's in or near the critical state. Now, you can dial a nuclear reactor up and down, but if you get it right, the consequences are worse than having to put on a sweater. The consequences are catastrophic. You can melt down the reactor and ultimately the entire financial world. So the danger I see is the Fed thinks they're playing with a thermostat, but they're playing with a nuclear reactor, and they risk collapsing the entire system.
So this idea of complexity and stability, very important, I believe. Our economic and financial systems, they are complex systems, which means they're inherently stable until they're not. At which point they often, and historically we can find, they rather rapidly find a new equilibrium point once we're past some sort of disturbed threshold. How do you see the world financial system going forward? Is it a binary event, either it survives or it crashes, or is there some happy, slower medium in there?
Well, I don't think there's necessarily a happy medium. I agree completely, Chris, with the way these things play out. You either have a catastrophic collapse or you do one or more smart things to step back from the brink. Sometimes in making my recommendations, people say, hey, Jim, you want to go backwards? And my answer is, if you're about to drive off a cliff, going backwards is a very good idea. But the other thing, you're right about how complex systems collapse. So the thing that's less well understood is that the risk or the degree of collapse in a complex system is not just a linear function of scale, it's an exponential function. And what that means in plain English is that if you triple or quadruple, let's say, the amount of derivatives on balance sheets, Wall Street would tell you you're not increasing the risk at all because you have longs and shorts offsetting. It's very clear that that's incorrect. That's not a proper understanding of the statistical properties of risk. In fact, the risk is not in the net, it's in the gross. So if you increase the gross volume of derivatives, let's say, by 5 times, you've increased the risk. But a lot of people would say, well, maybe then you've increased the risk by a factor of 5. But the answer is no. If you increase the size by 5 times, you've probably increased the risk by 100 times or 1,000 times. In other words, it's an exponential function. This is the way complex systems work, but again, it's not understood on Wall Street, and this is why policymakers are surprised over and over. They didn't see the crash in 2007, 2008 coming. When it started, they underestimated the severity of it. When they responded, they underestimated the duration of it. They got everything wrong. Well, again, if you're looking through the wrong end of the telescope, you are going to get everything wrong. This just comes as no surprise because they're using the wrong paradigms and the wrong methods of understanding how the world actually works. I hear these Wall Street guys, and they say they have these catastrophic so-called black swan type events, and they say, well, I need to go back and fix my models. And my answer is, no, your models are fine. Your paradigm is wrong. In other words, you have correctly modeled a false reality, and until you understand how things actually work, you're never going to get it right. So therefore, it is that kind of collapse is a likely outcome. You can step back from it, and the key is to descale the system, break the system into pieces, so that if individual pieces fail, it doesn't cause contagion, take down the system as a whole. My favorite example is J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan Bank today is the result of 5 different banks, each one quite large in and of itself. When I started in banking, you had Manufacturers Hanover, you had Chemical Bank, you had the Chase Bank, you had an old version of J.P. Morgan, and other banks all merged into one. Why not break them up into pieces? Why not ban over-the-counter derivatives? I think exchange-traded futures are fine because they have a lot of controls around them, but the over-the-counter derivatives do not. Get rid of the dangerous products, break up the big banks, and then move forward. You still have an economy and a financial system, but you have a lot less risk.
So let me ask you something very specifically around this, which has been puzzling me for a while, and I've dug and I can't find an answer that satisfies me. So the ISDA and European regulators bent over backwards in order to avoid triggering a default event, a credit event on the Greek CDS. Paper that's outstanding. And so I looked at that, and there's 78 billion notional on it, of which, the net exposure was said to be in the vicinity of maybe 3.8 billion, of which at auction, if they settled that out at 50 cents on the dollar, there's maybe 1.7 billion of total exposure. Why are they bending over so hard to avoid such a nominal amount of money?
Well, I wouldn't say they're bending over hard. I would say they're utterly corrupt, meaning clearly it is a default. Their failure to call it that just shows how corrupt the system actually is. But to get into your specific question, Chris, the reason is that if you actually did declare a default, the exposure is not the net of kind of 1 or 2 billion that you described. The exposure is the whole 78 billion, because I'll just take a single institution. Let's say I'm 5 billion long and I'm 4.9 billion short. And I'm going to lose the entire value of my 4.9 billion short. Well, the only way I preserve myself is if I can go to the 5 billion long and collect. But what if I can't collect? What if it's AIG? In other words, this is not just about market risk and notional risk, it's also about credit risk. So the only way the net is meaningful is if I'm certain that I can collect on my long in case my short has lost value. But they're not certain about that. When you start having institution go to institution to collect the entire gross value of the bet, you're going to have failures. You're going to have people who can't pay, and then that will cause a set of dominoes to collapse the entire system. So the reason they're trying so hard to posture the way you described, which is netting out the longs and shorts, going to the net the net amount, marking it to market, some value, et cetera, is because the reality of the gross exposure is one that would take down the entire system. But that is the reality, and to pretend otherwise, it just shows how desperate they are.
So let's talk about that desperation a bit, because if we take this dynamic of the past 4 decades,